There are places that hold their secrets the way old wood holds a nail, tight, deep, and without apology. A greenhouse at the end of a dirt road in Harlan County was one of those places. Its glass panes were clouded with decades of mineral dust. Its iron frame had gone the color of dried blood. The padlock on the door had not been touched in 4 years, and the weeds along the foundation had grown tall enough to brush the lower sill. To every person who passed it on County Road 41, it looked like something that had already given up. Nora Tillman had not asked for it. She had not expected it. When the attorney read the name of the property into the quiet room where the family had gathered, someone laughed. Then someone else did. The greenhouse, the old wreck out in Harlan. Left to Nora, who had met the woman who built it exactly twice in her life, and who was standing in that room with $41 in her checking account and a car that burned oil on the highway. The laughter was not cruel. It was the laughter of people who believed they already understood what something was worth. But Edith Voss had spent 60 years learning a truth that most people never get close to. That the things left to rot in plain sight are sometimes the only things that were ever truly protected. That patience is its own kind of vault. That a woman working quietly in a greenhouse before dawn, year after year, with soil under her fingernails and no audience and no applause, can build something that no one sees coming until the floor comes up. Nora drove out on a Thursday morning in early April. The interstate gave way to a 2-lane state road. The state road gave way to gravel. The gravel gave way to dirt, and the trees came in close on both sides. And the world behind her got very small and very quiet. She had a pry bar on the passenger seat and a thermos of black coffee, and no plan beyond getting the door open. She did not know yet what was beneath the concrete floor. She did not know about the letter, or the jars, or the seeds wrapped in paper and labeled in a hand. So careful it looked like something meant to last. What she found inside that greenhouse did not make the news. No one filmed it. No one shared it on a screen or turned it into a story for strangers. It stayed where it belonged, in the county, in the community, in the slow and unhurried life of a place that had always known how to keep a secret. This is that story. It begins with a padlock the color of bark, and it ends with a light on inside a glass building at dusk. And everything in between is the life of a woman who planted more than she ever let anyone see. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between a water bill and a coupon circular, and Nora Tillman almost missed it. It was a single sheet of cream-colored paper from a law office in Harlan County, folded in thirds, the address typed in a font that suggested age and deliberateness. She stood at the mailbox in the flat gray light of a March afternoon and read it twice before she went back inside. Her great-aunt Edith Voss had died on February 22nd at the age of 89 in a county hospital 40 miles from the property she had worked her entire adult life. Nora had not known Edith was sick. She had not known much about Edith at all. She had met the woman exactly twice. Once at a family reunion when Nora was 7, in a park outside Knoxville where the adults drank sweet tea from a cooler and the children ran in packs through the heat. Edith had been the old woman at the end of the table, quiet, watching, with hands that looked like they had been built for a different, harder century. The second time was at Nora's mother's funeral 11 years ago. Edith had arrived alone, sat in the back row, and left before the reception. She had pressed a card into Nora's hand on the way out, a plain white card with nothing on it but a phone number written in pencil. Nora had kept it for years in a kitchen drawer, then lost it in a move. She had never called. The attorney's name was Gerald Huff, and his office was in a 2-story brick building on the main street of a town called Cutter's Mill. He had sent the notice to 7 members of the Voss family, and he asked them all to appear on March 15th at 2 in the afternoon. Nora drove down from Knoxville on roads she did not know well, with the heat in her car running uneven and a coffee she had bought at a gas station on Route 19 going cold in the cup holder. She had $41 in her checking account. She had a job 3 days a week doing data entry for a medical billing company, and it paid enough to keep the lights on and not much else. Her husband Dale had died 14 months before, suddenly, and the life they had built together had turned out to be smaller than either of them had known. She had not told her family how things stood. She did not want the conversation that would follow. Gerald Huff's office smelled like old paper and forced air heat. There were 7 chairs arranged in 2 rows, and 5 of them were filled by the time Nora arrived. She recognized her cousin Darren Voss right away. Broad-shouldered, wearing a canvas jacket with a company logo on the chest, sitting forward with his forearms on his knees, as though the reading were a meeting he had called himself. Beside him was his sister Paulette, who had driven up from Chattanooga and who kept checking a watch on her wrist. 2 older cousins Nora barely knew sat in the back row. A woman named Shirley, who had married into the family and outlasted the marriage, sat near the window with a tote bag in her lap. They all nodded at Nora when she came in. They had the careful, measured politeness of people waiting for a number to be called. Gerald Huff was a man in his mid-60s with the unhurried manner of someone who had delivered news of all kinds and learned to carry it the same way each time. He had a thin file on his desk and a pair of glasses he set on his nose without ceremony. He explained that Edith Voss had died without a spouse, without children, and with a modest estate that consisted primarily of 1 parcel of real property, a half-acre lot and the structure upon it, located at the end of a dirt 2-track off County Road 41 in the eastern part of Harlan County. The structure was a greenhouse. It had been built by Edith's late husband in 1957, and Edith had worked it alone since his death in 1979. There was also a small savings account with a balance of $214. The property itself, Gerald Huff noted, had been assessed by the county at $11,000, though he was careful to say that assessments and values were not the same thing. He paused. He looked at the file. He read the name of the beneficiary, Nora Tillman, sole heir to the property, the structure, and the account. The room took a breath. Then Darren made a sound, not quite a laugh, but close, and Paulette pressed her lips together in a way that meant the same thing. One of the older cousins in the back said something under his breath that Nora did not catch. Shirley, to her credit, said nothing at all and looked at the window. The greenhouse. The old wreck out in Harlan that nobody had driven past in years, left to Nora, who had barely spoken to Edith, who lived 2 hours away, who presumably had no use for a ruined glass building at the end of a dirt road in a county she had visited maybe 4 times in her life. Darren leaned back and laced his fingers behind his head. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had a clear sense of what things were worth and no patience for complications. He said he would give Nora $400 for the deed right there before they left the parking lot. Save everybody the trouble of dealing with a property that probably needed $10,000 in repairs before it was worth anything to anyone. He said it the way people say things they expect to be accepted. Nora looked at him. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She asked Gerald Huff what she needed to sign. She drove home in the flat gray light of a Tuesday afternoon and did not tell anyone what she was thinking. She was not sure yet that she was thinking anything. She sat at her kitchen table that evening with the deed in front of her and a cup of tea she let go cold, and a quiet in the apartment that had the particular texture of a life between things. She had not been out to Harlan County in 4 years. She did not know what condition the greenhouse was in, beyond what Gerald Huff had described, which was not much. She did not know why Edith had chosen her. She pressed the deed flat with both hands and looked at the address typed in the upper left corner, County Road 41, end of track. and something in the plainness of it held her attention longer than she expected. She found an old road atlas in the closet, the kind with the laminated cover and the state maps folded into sections. She opened it to Kentucky and found Harlan County near the eastern edge, the roads thinning out as they went deeper into the hills. She traced County Road 41 with one finger until it ran off the edge of the printed detail and into the white space at the margin. She closed the atlas. She washed her cup. She went to bed with the deed on the table and the atlas beside it, and she lay in the dark for a long time before she slept. Not planning, not deciding, just letting the name of the place sit in her mind the way a thing does when it is waiting to be understood. She left Knoxville at 6:45 on a Thursday morning in early April, before the traffic on the interstate had built to anything. The car was a 2004 Civic with 181,000 miles on it and a heater that worked on the driver's side only. She had a thermos of black coffee in the cup holder, a pry bar on the passenger seat that she had borrowed from the building super's utility closet, and the deed in a manila envelope tucked flat under the seat. She had told no one where she was going, not because she wanted to be secretive, but because she did not yet have the words for what she was doing or why, and she had learned in the last 14 months that it was better to say nothing than to say something incomplete. The interstate took her east and then south, through country that opened and flattened before it began to fold again into the first low ridges of the Cumberland Plateau. She drove in the left lane until the traffic thinned, then moved right and let the car settle into a steady 58 miles per hour, which was the speed at which the engine ran without complaint. The sky was the pale yellow-gray of early April, not quite clouds, not quite clear, the kind of sky that holds its intentions. She drank her coffee slowly and watched the exits go by. Truck stops, fast food, the names of towns she had never had reason to visit. By the time she crossed the county line into Harlan, the interstate had narrowed to a 4-lane state road, and the hills had come in close on both sides, dark with bare hardwood trees just beginning to bud. Route 42 took her off the state road and onto something quieter. The pavement here was older, patched in irregular shapes that gave the road a pieced-together quality, like a quilt made in a hurry. She passed a grain elevator with a rusted, corrugated roof, a post office the size of a large closet, 2 churches within a quarter-mile of each other, and a gas station with a single pump, and a hand-lettered sign that said crawlers and night crawlers and nothing else. The towns were barely towns, a cluster of buildings, a crossroads, a name on a green sign, and then pasture again, or tree line, or a hillside with a house sitting on it at an angle that suggested the land had shifted around it over decades. She passed a cattle gate standing open on a property where no cattle were visible. She passed a school bus parked in a driveway with its windows painted over white. The road kept narrowing. County Road 41 began as a paved lane, 1 car wide in most places, that curved away from Route 42 behind a stand of white oak. The pavement lasted about a mile before it gave way to packed gravel, then to gravel that had thinned and spread and was mostly stone and clay. She slowed the car to a pace that felt almost apologetic, picking her way around the deeper ruts. The tree canopy came together overhead in a loose arch, the branches not yet leafed out enough to block the sky, and the light that came through was diluted and directional, laying itself across the road in long, pale strips. There were no other tire tracks that she could see. The road had the feel of something that had been used last in another season. The 2 track she was looking for was not marked. Gerald Huff had told her it would be the second break in the tree line on the left after the old stone culvert, and she almost missed it anyway. A pair of ruts pressing into the undergrowth, grass grown high between them, the entrance half hidden by a branch that had come down in a winter storm and been pulled to one side, not quite out of the way. She stopped the car and looked at it for a moment. Then she pulled in slowly, the undercarriage scraping once over a high center section, the weeds brushing the underside of the doors with a sound like a broom being dragged across a wood floor. The world behind her closed in. The world ahead of her was just the ruts and the trees and the April sky through the branches. The greenhouse appeared after about 200 yards, in a clearing that had once been kept and was no longer. It was a structure roughly 40 feet long and 20 wide, with a hip roof of glass panes set in iron frames that had gone the color of old rust. Many of the panes were intact. 7 or 8 on the south-facing side were broken, the gaps covered with what looked like scraps of clear plastic sheeting, taped and retaped until the tape itself had failed and the plastic hung in tongues. The foundation was poured concrete, stained dark with years of moisture. Around the base, the weeds had grown thick enough to lean against the walls in places, and a volunteer sumac had pushed up through the concrete at the northeast corner and grown to a height of about 6 feet, its bark pale gray, its roots widening the crack at its base. The door was on the south end, wood-framed and sagging, held shut by a padlock so old and weathered it had turned the color of the bark on the sumac beside it. Nora sat in the car for a moment with the engine off and looked at it. She had not known what she expected. Something more ruined, maybe, or something smaller. The greenhouse was larger than the word had suggested in the attorney's office. Even standing empty and weather-worn, it had a presence, a deliberateness in the way it sat in the clearing, the iron frames of the roof still holding their geometry after 67 years. The concrete foundation still level. It was the kind of structure built by someone who expected it to be used for a long time, and it had been, and now it wasn't. And the difference was visible in every rusted hinge and hanging strip of plastic, but not in the bones of the thing. She got out of the car and walked toward it, her shoes picking up mud from the soft ground. The air smelled of wet earth and last year's leaf litter and something faintly mineral that she could not name. She walked the perimeter first, the way she had watched her father walk a property before he ever tried the door, measuring it with his eyes, not rushing. The north and west walls were in better shape than the south. The iron frames there had surface rust, but no structural give when she pressed against them. The concrete foundation was cracked in 3 places she could count, but the cracks were old and stable, the edges not fresh. She came around the south side and stopped. There was a row of terracotta pots along the base of the south wall, set on a narrow ledge of poured concrete that extended from the foundation like a curb. 12 pots. Each one held a plant, small, green, just leafing out. The kind of compact starts you put in the ground in late April when the frost risk was past. The soil in each pot was dark and moist, not the gray dry of soil that had been left to go weeks without water, but the dark, even moisture of soil tended recently. She crouched down and pressed a finger into the nearest pot. The soil gave cool and damp 2 inches down. Someone had watered these within the last 2 or 3 days. She looked at the pots for a long time. She looked at the padlock on the door. Then she stood up, went back to the car, and got the pry bar. The padlock did not give easily. It was a heavy brass body lock, the kind made before manufacturers started cutting weight, with a shackle thick enough that the pry bar found no purchase on the first try or the second. Nora worked the flat end of the bar behind the hasp plate instead, leaning her weight into it steadily, not forcing, letting the leverage do what forcing could not. The screws holding the hasp to the door frame were old wood screws, their slots filled with rust and paint from a decade of seasons, and they held for a long moment before the wood around the topmost one began to give with a sound like a knuckle popping. She worked the bar deeper. The hasp pulled free of the frame on the third sustained push, the screws still seated in the plate, the wood around them torn in a pale, clean crescent. The door swung inward 6 inches and stopped, swollen in its frame. She put her shoulder to it and it opened. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. peat moss and iron pipe and something older underneath. The particular closeness of a space that had been sealed and breathed and sealed again over many years. The smell of soil that had never fully dried, of wood that had absorbed decades of humidity and held it. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of a place that had been used hard and for a long time by someone who knew what they were doing. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes find the interior. The light came through the intact panes in long, dusty columns and fell across the floor at low angles. April light, still thin, still finding its angle for the season. Where panes were missing or covered, the light changed quality, flatter, less defined. The greenhouse was one long room with a central aisle running north to south, wide enough for a wheelbarrow. She walked the aisle slowly. On either side, waist-high benches of rough-sawn 2x6 pine ran the length of the building, supported on angle iron legs bolted to the concrete floor with 3/8-inch lag screws, the heads of which had rusted to the color of dried leaves. The bench surfaces were stained dark with years of pot rings and soil spills, the wood grain raised by moisture into a texture like corduroy. On the east bench, someone had laid out the framework of a potting operation that looked as though it had been interrupted mid-season and then simply not resumed. A galvanized trowel, a coil of jute twine, a stack of 4-inch nursery pots nested inside each other, a bag of perlite rolled shut and clipped with a wooden clothespin. Everything was dusty. Nothing was rotten. It had the quality of a kitchen where the cook had stepped out and not come back. The west bench held the seed packets. They were arranged in groups, each group held together with a rubber band, each packet hand-labeled in a careful script with a name and a year. She picked one up. The paper was a heavy craft stock, folded and glued, the kind you made yourself rather than bought. The label read, "Mortgage Lifter Tomato, 1988. The ink faded to brown, but still fully legible. She set it down and picked up another. Cherokee Purple, 1993. Dragon Tongue Bean, 2001. Glass Gem Corn, 2009. The oldest packet she found was dated 1974. A variety of pole bean she did not recognize called Greasy Cut Short, the name written in a slightly different hand, a little less assured, as though Edith had labeled it when she was still learning her own script. Nora stood at the bench for several minutes, moving through the groups with her fingers. There were more than she could count quickly. More than a season's worth. More than a decade's. The potting bench at the north end was built differently from the others. It was reclaimed barn board. Wide planks, maybe 16 inches across. The surface hand-planed, smooth and rubbed with linseed oil at some point far enough in the past that the oil had gone fully into the wood and left it with a low, dark sheen. The bench was freestanding, not bolted to the wall, and it had a lower shelf fitted with dovetail joints at the corners, the joinery too careful for a greenhouse workbench, the kind of work someone had done because they could not do it any other way. A name was scratched into the underside of the lower shelf in letters about an inch high. R. Voss, 1957. Edith's husband. Robert or Richard, or something that began with R. Gerald Huff had not mentioned a first name, and the deed only listed the original property holder as R. Voss, Est. The bench had been built the same year as the greenhouse by the man who built the greenhouse, and Edith had used it for 62 years after he was gone. Nora set her hand flat on the bench surface and left it there for a moment. Then she kept moving. The concrete floor ran the full length of the building, poured in sections, the seams between sections visible as straight lines crossing the aisle at intervals of about 8 feet. She had been walking it for 10 minutes before she heard it, not with her ears exactly, but with her feet. A section near the north end, roughly 4 feet by 3, that gave back a different sound when she stepped on it. Not hollow exactly. Lower. The sound a floor makes when there is space beneath it rather than packed earth. She stopped and walked back over it, then forward again. There it was. She crouched and looked at the surface. The concrete here was the same color and texture as the rest of it, the same aggregate, the same finish trowel marks. But the seam on the south edge of the section did not match the regular spacing of the other joints. It was a 1/4 inch wider, and when she ran her fingernail along it, the edge was sharper than the others, less worn, as though it had not been trafficked the same way. She went back to the door and got the pry bar from where she had set it against the frame. She came back to the north section and crouched again and worked the flat end of the bar into the wide seam at the south edge. She applied pressure slowly, the way she had with the hasp, steady, not forcing, letting the tool find what was there. The slab resisted for a long moment. Then she felt, rather than heard, the faintest give. A seal breaking. The kind of seal that forms when two surfaces have been in contact long enough to become one thing, and then reminded that they are not. She increased the pressure. The bar sank another 1/4 inch. And somewhere beneath the concrete, in the cool dark below the floor of a greenhouse at the end of a dirt road in Harlan County, something shifted. She heard him before she saw him, a deliberate footfall on the gravel outside, unhurried, the kind of step that announces itself on purpose so as not to startle. Then a pause at the open door, and a shadow falling across the concrete at the threshold, and a voice, low, unhurried, carrying the flat vowels of the eastern hills, saying only that he had seen the car come up the track and thought he would bring something cold. Nora sat back on her heels and looked toward the door. The man standing there was in his mid-70s, lean in the way that men who have worked outdoors their whole lives go lean, with a face that had been in the weather long enough to look like it belonged there. He was holding a wide-mouth mason jar filled with water, condensation already beating on the outside. In his other hand, loose at his side, was a pry bar, a longer one than hers with a curved crow's foot at the end, the steel worn bright at the working edge. His name was Earl Pickett. He said so without being asked, setting the jar on the edge of the west bench and extending a hand that had the grip of a man who had forgotten he had one. He owned the 30-acre parcel directly east, the one that backed up to the tree line behind the greenhouse, and he had farmed it in one way or another for 41 years. He had known Edith Voss since before her husband passed. He did not say this in a way that required a response, and Nora did not give him one. She took the jar and drank from it and set it back on the bench, and Earl walked the length of the aisle the way she had, hands at his sides, looking at the benches, the seed packets, the potting bench at the north end with R. Voss scratched into the underside of the lower shelf. He did not touch anything. He just looked, the way a person looks at a place they know well and are seeing again after an absence. He came to stand beside her at the north section of floor without comment. Looked down at the pry bar she had worked into the seam, looked at the seam itself, and crouched with the ease of a man whose knees had not yet decided to make his life difficult. He pressed 2 fingers to the wider joint and ran them along its length the way she had, feeling the sharpness of the edge. Then he stood and held out his hand for her bar without saying anything. She gave it to him. He worked it into the south seam alongside his own bar, spacing them about 14 inches apart, and looked at her once. She put her hands on his bar, and he put his hands on his own bar, and they both applied pressure at the same time, steadily, not rushing it. The slab resisted for 3 full seconds. Then it broke its seal with a sound like a jar lid popping, and the section lifted a 1/4 inch. And the smell that came up from below was cool and dry and faintly mineral, the smell of undisturbed earth that had been enclosed for a long time. They set the bars aside and got their fingers under the edges and lifted. The slab was 3 inches of poured concrete, roughly 4 feet by 3, and it weighed enough that they had to set it down once, reset their grips, and lift again before they could walk it clear of the opening and lay it flat on the aisle beside the hole. Nora's lower back registered the weight. Earl set his end down with a controlled ease that suggested he had lifted heavier things more recently than she had. They stood over the opening and looked down. Below the concrete was a cavity approximately 18 inches deep, the walls lined with mortared fieldstone, the floor packed clay. In it sat a galvanized steel box, rectangular, the kind used for fire-rated document storage, with a pair of latches on the front face and a handle on top. The box had been set on a folded piece of canvas to keep it off the clay, and the canvas was dry. Everything in the cavity was dry. Earl did not reach for it. He stepped back and picked up his pry bar from where he had set it and held it loosely. He looked at Nora and then at the box in the way that people look at things that are not theirs to touch. And he stayed that way. Nora crouched at the edge of the opening and reached in and took the handle of the box. It was heavier than its size suggested. She lifted it clear of the cavity and set it on the floor beside her, and sat back on her heels and looked at it. The latches were not locked. They were the simple over-center type, the kind you pressed down and they released. She pressed the first one, then the second. She opened the lid. She did not say anything. Earl did not come closer or ask what was inside. He stood where he was and waited, and the greenhouse was quiet around them, the light through the intact panes having moved a few degrees since morning. The shadows shorter now, the April air outside carrying the first real warmth of the day through the open door. A sparrow landed on the outside sill of the nearest intact pane, looked in for a moment and left. The kind of detail that doesn't mean anything and stays with you anyway. After a while, Nora closed the lid of the box and latched it and stood up. She looked at Earl. He was watching her with an expression that held nothing more than attention. Not curiosity, not expectation. Just the steady regard of a man who had learned to let things be what they were. She asked him what he wanted for his help. He picked up the jar of water from the bench where she had set it and held it out to her again. And when she took it, he said she was welcome to finish it. It was only water. She asked again, differently, what he wanted, for the time, for coming over. He shook his head once, slowly, in a way that closed the subject. He picked up his pry bar and walked toward the door, and then stopped with his hand on the frame, his back still to her. He said Edith had mentioned her, not often. Once or twice over the years, in the way that people mention the things they have decided about without quite saying so. He said Edith was not a woman who did things without a reason, and she was not a woman who made decisions at the end that she had not been making quietly for a long time before. He paused for a moment, looking out through the open door at the clearing. He said she had watered those pots on the south wall himself, twice a week since February, because Edith had asked him to last fall and he had said he would. He said the starts were a variety of climbing bean that Edith had been selecting and saving since 1981, and that they would need to go into the ground by the first week of May, or they would get leggy. He did not look back when he said any of this. He just said it to the open air of the clearing, and then he walked out into it and did not return. She sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket near the north end of the aisle and held the galvanized box on her knees for a moment before she opened it again. The metal was cool against her palms. Outside, she could hear the sound of Earl's footsteps receding across the gravel, and then nothing. Just the wind moving through the tree line and the occasional tick of the iron roof frame expanding in the midday warmth. The greenhouse held its quiet around her the way old buildings do, with a density to the silence that felt accumulated rather than empty. She pressed the latches again and opened the lid all the way and set it against the side of the bucket and looked at what was inside. The money was banded in groups, each group wrapped in a strip of brown paper tape rather than a printed bank band, the amounts written on the tape in Edith's careful hand. $40, $60, $100. The bills were mixed denominations, 10s and 20s mostly, some 5s, a few singles tucked at the ends of the stacks to round the totals. She counted the bundles first without unwrapping them, 17 in all, arranged in 2 layers with a folded piece of wax paper between the layers to keep them from sticking. When she added the amounts written on the tape, she got $8,400. She set the bundles on the concrete beside the bucket in 2 careful rows and looked at them. They were not new bills. They were the kind of bills that had been used and saved over a long period of time, their edges soft, their surfaces worn to a matte finish. Some of the older ones had a faint greenish tint along the borders where the ink had aged. A few carried the kind of fold lines you get from a wallet or an apron pocket. Beneath the 2 layers of banded bills, the box held 3 savings passbooks. They were the size of a small notebook, each one with a pale green cover and a name embossed in gold on the front: Harlan County Federal Savings and Loan. The institution name was printed in a typeface that had not been in use for a long time. She opened the first passbook. The account had been opened in April of 1973 in the name of Edith M. Voss, with an initial deposit of $50. The entries ran in neat columns, hand-stamped by a teller, through transactions dated as recently as 1991. The final balance was $412. The second passbook showed a similar history. Opened in 1978, closed in balance in the same year the first one ended. The third was older still. The cover faded and the binding cracked at the spine. Opened in 1968 with a deposit of $22 and carrying entries in a stamp so light in the later pages that she had to tilt the book toward the window light to read them. Harlan County Federal Savings and Loan had been acquired and dissolved in 1992. The accounts had not been transferred. Whatever balances remained in those books at closing had become, in the legal language of such things, dormant funds, subject to esquittement, claimed by the state after a period of inactivity, absorbed into a ledger somewhere, and never returned. She set the passbooks beside the bills and looked at the bottom of the box. There was one more thing: a folded sheet of paper, not an envelope, just a single sheet folded twice into quarters, her name written on the outside in the same hand as the tape on the bills. Not Nora Tillman. Just Nora. She recognized the handwriting from the seed packet labels, though it was slightly less steady here, written more recently. The pressure of the pen lighter in the way that handwriting goes light when a hand has lost some of its certainty. She unfolded it. It was not a letter, not yet. It was a set of directions. 5 lines, plain and specific. Go to the north wall, measure 4 feet from the east corner. Find the panel where the board spacing is wider than the others. Press the lower left corner in and then pull. And do not be in a hurry about what you find behind it. The last line said only, "The money in the box is yours to use as you need. The rest is yours to decide what to do with. Come to the wall when you are ready." She folded the paper once and held it in both hands and sat still. The light through the panes had moved again, the columns of it thinner now as the sun climbed toward noon and the angle changed. A thread of wind found the open door and moved through the aisle and lifted one of the seed packets at the edge of the west bench and set it down again. She watched it settle. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. Not relief, not excitement, not the particular lightness of a problem being solved. What she felt was more like the sensation of a room that has just been entered for the first time, the sense that the dimensions of it are not yet established, that more space may exist than is currently visible. She sat with it. She did not rush it. After a while, she began putting the bills back into the box. She was careful about the order, returning the bundles to their 2 layers with the wax paper between them, the passbooks on top, the folded note on top of those. She closed the lid and latched it and carried it to the car and set it on the floor behind the driver's seat. Then she came back inside and stood at the south end of the aisle and looked north toward the wall. 4 feet from the east corner. She did not go to it yet. She poured the last inch of coffee from her thermos, cold now, and drank it standing up. She ate half a sleeve of crackers she found in her jacket pocket. She walked back to the south wall and checked the terracotta pots along the ledge, pressing her fingers into the soil of each one, the way Earl had done, she imagined, twice a week since February. All 12 were adequately moist. The bean starts were compact and dark green, the first true leaves past the seed leaves, the stems thick enough to suggest they had been grown in good light. She straightened each pot that had shifted on the ledge. She did not know yet why she was doing this, whether she was delaying or simply being careful. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. She walked up the aisle to the north wall and stood in front of it and counted board widths from the east corner. 4 feet put her at a section where the vertical boards were cedar, 1 inch by 6, the same as the rest of the wall, except that in this section, the spacing between boards was a 1/4 inch wider than anywhere else she could see. She crouched and pressed the lower left corner of the panel the note described. The board flexed inward slightly, the kind of flex that means it is not fastened at that point. She pressed harder. Something behind the wall released with a soft, clean click, a sound entirely unlike the rust and resistance of everything else she had opened today. The panel swung outward on hinges she had not seen, 2 inches, then 4, then as far as her hand could take it, revealing the dark interior of a space behind the wall that had been there, sealed and waiting, for a very long time. The space behind the panel was roughly 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide. The same cedar board construction as the wall face, the interior surfaces dry and undisturbed. Someone had lined the floor of it with a double layer of roofing felt, tacked flat, and on top of the felt sat 7 wide-mouth mason jars, quart-sized, their lids sealed with the 2-piece canning bands that Edith's generation had used for everything that needed to last. Each jar was filled with bills rolled tight and secured with a rubber band, the rolls packed in so that the jar could not have held another one. Beside the jars, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of waxed linen cord, was a bundle about the size of a hardcover book. And behind the bundle, standing upright against the back wall of the space, was an envelope, a standard white business envelope, unsealed, with Nora's name on the front in the same light, careful hand as the note in the galvanized box. She took the jars out first, one at a time, and set them in a row on the potting bench. She did not open them yet. She counted the rolls inside each one through the glass, estimating denominations by color and thickness. When she had looked at all 7 jars, she sat on the edge of the bench and did a rough calculation in her head, the way her father had taught her to estimate a load of lumber before measuring it. The number she arrived at was somewhere above $60,000. She said nothing out loud. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment and then set it in her lap. The greenhouse held its quiet. She opened the oilcloth bundle next. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of wax paper, were seed packets, but not like the ones on the west bench. These were older, the paper a heavier stock, some of them dated before 1970. The ink on the labels faded nearly to invisibility in places. Tucked among them were 2 folded sheets of paper covered in handwritten notes, variety names, cross-reference numbers, observations about germination rates and days to maturity going back decades. It was a seed library within the seed library, the inner collection, the varieties Edith had considered too significant or too fragile to leave on an open bench. Nora wrapped them carefully in the wax paper again and set the bundle at the end of the potting bench where it would not be disturbed. Then she picked up the envelope. She carried it to the south end of the aisle, where the light was best through the intact panes, and sat on the overturned bucket and opened it. Inside were 4 sheets of paper, both sides of each sheet covered in the same careful hand, the lines close but not cramped, written in blue ink that had not faded. At the top of the first page, centered and underlined, "For Nora." Below that, a date, March 3rd of the previous year. And then the letter began. Edith wrote the way she must have spoken, without preamble, without apology. She said she was 88 years old and that she had been a healthy woman her whole life and did not intend to be otherwise, but that she was not naive about arithmetic. She said she had spent the previous winter deciding what to do with what she had built, and that deciding had not been difficult once she stopped trying to be fair and started trying to be right, and that those were not always the same thing. She said she was leaving the greenhouse and everything in it to Nora, because Nora was the only one in the family who had ever looked at a thing that was broken and appeared to be thinking about how it worked rather than what it would cost to fix. She had seen this at the reunion when Nora was 7 years old, watching a boy try to fix a bicycle chain and asking him the right questions. Edith had remembered it for 41 years. She said she was aware that this might seem like a thin basis for a decision of this size, and that she did not care. The second page was the account of the greenhouse itself, how Robert had built it in the spring of 1957 from salvaged iron framing and glass from a school gymnasium that had been demolished in Pineville, hauling it load by load in a borrowed flatbed truck. How they had grown vegetables commercially for 11 years before the regional wholesale market collapsed and made it unworkable. How Edith had shifted after Robert died in '79 to growing for individual families in the county who needed produce they could not afford at the store, elderly people whose gardens had become too much to manage, anyone who came to the end of the dirt track and knocked. She had never charged for any of it. She had never announced it. She said that anonymity was not modesty. It was practicality. Once people knew you were giving something away, she wrote, they stopped valuing it the way they should. The third page was about the money. Edith had saved for 60 years on a greenhouse worker's income, which she described without complaint as modest and without decoration as sufficient. She had used cash because she did not trust institutions to remain institutions, and because the passbooks she had kept in the 40s and 50s had taught her what happened to savings when a bank found it convenient to close. The $8,400 in the galvanized box was what she called walking around money, enough to give Nora time to think without the pressure of the calendar. The jars behind the panel were the accumulated savings of 31 years and were not to be rushed through. She listed the current count, $61,400. She said she was not sentimental about money, that it was only useful in proportion to what it was used for, and that she was trusting Nora to determine that proportion herself. She did not give instructions. She said instructions were for people who did not trust the person they were leaving things to. The fourth page was shorter than the others. Edith wrote that the seed stock on the west bench represented 50 years of selection and saving, and that the inner collection in the oilcloth bundle behind the panel was irreplaceable in the literal sense. Those varieties existed nowhere else in any catalog or seed bank she had ever been able to locate. She asked that they be grown, not stored. She said a seed that is only stored is a seed that is only waiting to die. She asked that whatever Nora decided to do with the greenhouse, she not let the climbing bean starts in the terracotta pots go into the ground past the first week of May. She said Earl Pickett would help with anything structural and would not need to be asked twice, and that he was a good man who had been a good neighbor for 40 years and deserved to be treated accordingly. And then, on the last 3 lines of the 4th page, she closed the letter. She wrote that she had lived in this greenhouse and beside it, and because of it, for most of her adult life, and that she did not regret a morning of it. She wrote that the best thing she had ever done was also the quietest thing, and that she hoped Nora would find the same to be true of whatever came next. She signed it, Edith M. Voss, Harlan County, Kentucky. Beneath the signature in smaller letters, almost as an afterthought, the floor is solid. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Nora read the letter twice. She sat with it in her hands after the second reading and looked at the light coming through the south panes, the columns of it fallen almost to horizontal now, the afternoon having moved further than she had noticed. She did not wipe her face. She did not make a sound. She sat on the overturned bucket in the quiet of the greenhouse with the letter in her hands and the 7 jars on the bench behind her, and the open panel still swung out on its hinges. And she stayed that way for a long time, until the light changed again, and she heard the first birds of the evening starting up in the tree line to the east. She had been back 3 times before he appeared. The first return was 2 days after the initial visit, with a box of contractor garbage bags, a push broom, and a notepad, on which she made an inventory of every broken pane, every failed seal, every lag screw that had worked loose from its anchor in the concrete floor. The second visit she brought 2 gallons of linseed oil and a set of natural bristle brushes, and spent 4 hours working the potting bench, the R. Voss bench at the north end, the lower shelf of which she cleaned with a dry cloth before oiling, careful not to obscure the lettering scratched into the wood. The third visit she spent mostly outside, cutting the sumac at the northeast corner to the base with a handsaw and digging out the root ball with a mattock, packing the widened crack in the foundation with hydraulic cement that she mixed in a coffee can and pressed in with a margin trowel. Her lower back ached for 2 days afterward. She did not mind it. It was on the 4th visit, a Tuesday afternoon in late April, that she heard a car on the 2-track. Not the particular sound of Earl Pickett's truck, which she had come to recognize, a diesel with a loose heat shield that rattled at low speeds. This was something quieter, newer, with the sound of tires that had not been on gravel many times. She was at the south wall replacing a cracked pane with a piece of tempered glass she had cut at a shop in Cutter's Mill, when the car pulled into the clearing and stopped beside her Civic. She set the glass carefully against the wall and took off her work gloves and waited. The man who got out was perhaps 50, with the careful grooming of someone who considered appearance a professional tool. He wore a canvas field jacket over a collared shirt, clean work boots that had never seen a job site, and he carried a clipboard with a stack of papers secured under the clip. He looked at the greenhouse before he looked at her, in the way that people look at property before they look at people, assessing, measuring, running numbers behind eyes that were already reaching a conclusion. Then he turned to her and smiled the kind of smile that arrives before the face is ready for it. He introduced himself as Curtis Boyle, said he was with a land development consultancy based out of Lexington, and that he had been trying to reach the estate of Edith Voss for some months regarding a matter of mutual interest. Nora told him the estate had been settled. He nodded as though he had expected this. He said he was aware, actually, that the property had transferred, and that he was glad to have the opportunity to speak with her directly because that simplified things considerably. He said it in the tone of a man who found most things simpler than others expected them to be. She did not offer her hand. She did not offer him anything to sit on, though the overturned bucket was visible just inside the open door. He did not seem to require either. He came to stand a few feet from her with the clipboard at his side and looked again at the greenhouse, this time with a more deliberate attention, the way an appraiser looks. Not at the thing itself, but at what the thing could become in different hands. He told her his company had been working with a regional road authority on a corridor improvement project in eastern Harlan County. The details were what she might expect: widening, realignment, updated drainage. He said the corridor in question ran along the eastern edge of County Road 41, and that properties within a certain proximity had been identified as potentially relevant to the project's right-of-way requirements. He said the word relevant carefully, the way people use words that have a legal sense they prefer not to name directly. He said her property was among those identified, and that his company was in a position to make a straightforward cash offer that would spare her the delays and uncertainties of the formal condemnation process. He let the word condemnation land, and then moved past it quickly, as though he had not been aware of its weight. He set the clipboard on the hood of his car and unclipped the top sheet and held it out to her. It was a 1-page offer letter on company letterhead, the terms printed in a clean sans serif font. the amount stated plainly at the center of the page. $19,000 for the parcel, the greenhouse structure and all appurtenance, with a 30-day closing period and a standard as-is clause. $19,000. She took the sheet and read it without expression. The amount was more than the county assessment and less than a third of what was in the 7 mason jars on the potting bench behind her, though he could not have known that. She read the terms twice. The as-is clause meant the seed stock, the potting bench with R. Voss scratched into its lower shelf, the terracotta pots along the south wall, the inner collection wrapped in oilcloth. All of it, as is, for $19,000. She folded the sheet once and held it at her side. Curtis Boyle retrieved his clipboard and held it loosely and looked at the greenhouse again. He said he wanted to be candid with her, that the road project timeline was already set, that the right-of-way process moved slowly when it moved through the courts, and that property owners who engaged with that process directly sometimes found it more protracted and more expensive than they had anticipated. He said this pleasantly, without emphasis, the way people deliver soft threats, by making them sound like observations. He said he hoped she would take the time to consider it carefully and that he was available for any questions she might have. He produced a business card from the breast pocket of his canvas jacket and held it out. It was a heavy card stock, embossed, the kind that costs more per box than most people spend on a meal. Nora took the card. She looked at it. She looked at him. He had the steady, patient expression of a man who had made this kind of offer many times and knew that time was usually on his side. She thanked him for coming out. She said she would be in touch. He nodded, retrieved his clipboard, and walked back to his car, pausing at the door to look once more at the greenhouse with that same measuring expression, as though he were already subtracting it from the landscape. He backed the car out of the clearing slowly, and she listened to the sound of it on the gravel until it reached the pavement and disappeared. She stood in the clearing for a moment after he was gone, the card in one hand and the offer sheet still folded in the other. Then she went back inside. She set both items on the west bench beside the seed packets without reading the offer again. She picked up the first pane of tempered glass she had leaned against the south wall before he arrived and fitted it into the frame from which she had removed the cracked one, pressing it into the glazing compound she had already applied, running her thumb along the edges to seat it. The glass held. She pressed a glazing point into each corner with the tip of a putty knife. She stepped back and looked at it. Clear, level, the compound smooth at the edges. Then she picked up the second pane and went to work on the next frame, and the afternoon continued around her the way it had before, unhurried, the light through the new pane falling clean and unbroken across the concrete floor. Gerald Huff did not seem surprised when Nora called. He listened without interrupting while she described Curtis Boyle's visit, the offer letter, the mention of condemnation proceedings and road corridor timelines. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man sorting through a filing cabinet he knows well. He said he would need to see the offer letter and that she should not sign anything or respond in writing until he had looked at the road authority's public filings, which were a matter of county record and which he could pull himself. He said the word condemnation had a specific legal meaning and a specific process attached to it, and that being told about that process informally by a private developer was not the same thing as that process having begun. He said she should come in on Thursday. She drove down Thursday morning and sat across from him for an hour and a half while he read the offer letter twice and made notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting she could not decipher from across the desk. When he was done, he set his pen down and told her that the road project was real, but that its right-of-way boundary, as filed with the county, ran along the western shoulder of County Road 41, on the opposite side of the road from her property. He said this without editorial comment. He did not need to add any. The legal process of formalizing the inheritance had begun the week after the attorney's reading, and moved at the pace such things move, steadily, without drama, requiring patience more than urgency. Gerald Huff handled the title search and the probate documentation. There was a lien from a farm supply account that Edith had left unpaid at her death, $231, which Nora paid in cash at the counter of the supply store in Cutter's Mill, without negotiating. The woman behind the counter, who was in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked at the cash and then at Nora and said she was glad someone had come in finally, that Edith had been a good customer for 30 years and that the account had been carried without interest as a courtesy, and that she hoped things were going all right out there on County Road 41. Nora said they were going. The woman nodded and did not ask more than that. It was that conversation, brief and unremarkable, that made Nora start asking. Not pressing, not investigating. Just asking, the way you ask when you have begun to understand that the people around a place know things about it that the place itself cannot tell you. She asked Earl Pickett first on a morning when he appeared at the greenhouse door, as he sometimes did, with no particular announcement, to help her rehang the door on the south end that had swollen and warped beyond what she could correct alone. He held the door while she drove new 3-inch screws through the hinge leaves into the replaced frame, and she asked him what he knew about Edith's arrangement with families in the county. The produce, the loans, the things Edith had mentioned in the letter. Earl held the door steady and thought about it. He said he knew about the Gruber family on Route 17, who had gone through 2 bad harvests in the mid-90s and had received boxes of produce every week for 8 months without being told who sent them, until Dale Gruber Sr. drove every road in the county looking and eventually ended up at the end of the 2-track. And Edith had made him coffee and not admitted to anything. He said he knew about the Yancey boy who had needed $250 to keep his truck registered and his job, and had found an envelope under his door with exactly that amount and a note that said only, "Pay it forward when you can." He said he suspected there were more that he did not know, because Edith had been careful in a way that suggested practice. The woman who ran the seed lending library at the county extension office 3 towns over was named Patrice Mullins, and she drove out to the greenhouse on a Wednesday afternoon in early May without being invited, having heard from someone who had heard from someone else that Edith Voss's property had been inherited, and that whoever had it might want to know what Edith had been contributing. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with the direct manner of someone who spent her professional life trying to keep useful things from disappearing. She stood at the potting bench and looked at the seed packets with an expression that was careful and controlled. The same expression, Nora thought, that Earl had worn when he first walked the length of the aisle. Patrice said that Edith had been supplying the library with heirloom seed stock since its founding in 2003, mailing packets twice a year in padded envelopes with no return address, the varieties labeled in that same careful hand. The library had cross-referenced the varieties against national databases and found that 11 of them were not listed in any commercial or preservation catalog. They had been designated as regionally unique. Patrice said the word unique the way scientists say it, without inflation, meaning precisely what it said. The picture assembled itself not all at once, but in the way that pictures do when you are not forcing them. A detail here, a recollection there, each one fitting against the others the way the seed packets fit together in their rubber-banded groups on the west bench. A retired schoolteacher named Wanda Cope, who had grown up on a farm bordering Edith's property and had moved away at 19 and come back at 62, told Nora over the phone that Edith had given her mother vegetable starts every spring for 20 years, starting in the year after Wanda's father left, without being asked and without discussion, simply leaving them in wooden flats at the end of the 2-track before dawn. A man named Thomas Bright, who operated a small orchard on the north side of the county, said Edith had grafted his first 12 apple trees from her own rootstock in 1984 and refused payment in any form, saying only that an orchard takes 20 years to hit its stride, and that was payment enough to know it was coming. He said his orchard had 400 trees now. He said this plainly. The way people state facts they have stopped being surprised by. Curtis Boyle did not return. Gerald Huff sent a letter to the development consultancy in Lexington, citing the county's filed right-of-way boundary and noting that the property in question fell outside it by a margin of 140 feet. The consultancy replied with a brief letter that acknowledged the discrepancy and withdrew the offer. No apology. No explanation of the discrepancy. Just a withdrawal, clean and prompt, as though the offer had been a probe sent in a direction that turned out to have something solid in it. Gerald Huff filed the reply in his cabinet and called Nora to tell her. The call lasted 4 minutes. He said she was clear, and she said thank you, and that was the end of it. What Nora understood, by the time the legal work was fully settled in the 3rd week of May, was that Edith Voss had spent 60 years doing something that left no single large mark and 10,000 small ones, the kind that only become visible when you look at the whole surface from a distance. There had been no organization, no committee, no named fund. There had been a woman and a greenhouse, and a willingness to get up before the light and put things at the end of a dirt road for people who needed them. The community did not gather to say this in any formal way. There was no ceremony. People simply told Nora the things they knew, one at a time, over the course of several weeks. And each thing they told her settled into place alongside the others. And the weight of it was not heavy in the way of grief, but in the way of understanding, the kind that changes the dimensions of a room you thought you already knew. The climbing bean starts went into the ground on the 28th of April, 3 days before Earl Pickett's deadline, and 8 days after Nora had driven back to Knoxville to give notice on her apartment. She had not made the decision all at once. She had made it the way you make decisions that have already been made somewhere below the level of deliberation, gradually becoming aware that it was done, that the question had been settled while she was doing other things, that what remained was only logistics. She gave the building super back his pry bar with a 6-pack of beer in thanks, and packed what fit in the Civic, and left the rest with her neighbor Mrs. Aldridge, who had a storage unit and did not ask questions. She drove back down on a Tuesday morning with the heater running on the driver's side only, and the back seat full, and the Atlas open to Kentucky on the passenger seat, though she no longer needed it. Earl had prepared the bed along the south wall while she was gone. He had turned the soil 18 inches deep with a spading fork, worked in 2 wheelbarrow loads of finished compost from the pile behind his barn, and built a simple trellis from cedar posts and galvanized wire that ran the full length of the wall at 8-foot intervals. He had set the posts with a hand auger, 3 feet deep, tamped tight. The wire was strung at 6-inch intervals up to a height of 6 feet, tensioned with turnbuckles at each end post. It was the kind of work that took 2 days and looked like it had been there always. When Nora arrived and saw it, she stood at the edge of the bed for a long time without speaking. Earl was in the greenhouse resetting a GFCI outlet he had found in the north wall, its plastic face yellowed and its ground prong corroded to the point of failure. She did not interrupt him. She planted the starts herself, one by one, pressing each root ball into a hole she made with 3 fingers, firming the soil around the stem with both thumbs. The bean Edith had been selecting since 1981 had no commercial name that Nora had found. The label on the terracotta pots had said only, "Climbing Bean, Voss Selection," and the inner notes in the oilcloth bundle had described it as a pole type with a 63-day maturity, dark green curved pods, white seeds with a faint purple blush, exceptional flavor when dried. 12 plants went in along the base of the trellis, spaced 8 inches apart, staked loosely with lengths of jute twine until they found the wire. She watered each one in with a full gallon from the can she had filled at the outdoor spigot on the east side of the greenhouse. A spigot so old, the threads were nearly gone and the handle had been replaced with a section of pipe fitted with a hose clamp, which turned with a sound like a small complaint each time and then ran clean and cold. The first 2 months were work, steady, physical, undramatic work of the kind that accumulates rather than announces itself. She replaced 12 panes of glass, repointed the mortar on the north and east foundation walls, rehung the 2 interior shelf brackets that had pulled from their anchors, and recaulked the ridge seam at the peak of the roof from a borrowed extension ladder that she moved along the outside of the building in sections. She opened the greenhouse 2 mornings a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, from 7 until noon, with a hand-lettered sign at the end of the 2-track that said only, "Produce and starts, in season, no charge." Patrice Mullins from the extension office drove out the first Tuesday and brought 3 people she thought might be interested. By the 3rd Tuesday, there were 8 cars on the 2-track. By June, there were more than she could count from the door. She did not replicate everything Edith had done. She could not have, and she did not try. What she did was tend what was there and add what she understood, and the understanding grew with the season. She learned which panes needed a second coat of glazing compound before winter. She learned that the bench on the east side ran 2 degrees warmer than the west bench because of its proximity to the south-facing wall, and she moved her earliest starts there in March to take advantage of it. She learned that Earl Pickett would appear without announcement whenever something needed a second pair of hands, and would disappear with the same discretion, and that the correct response to this was to have coffee ready and to ask about his orchard trees, which he was quietly grafting from Thomas Bright's rootstock, and which he discussed with the same careful attention he gave everything else. The letter from Edith she kept in the potting bench drawer, the wide, shallow one below the R. Voss shelf, in a manila envelope that she had sealed with a strip of the same brown paper tape Edith had used on the bill bundles. She did not read it often. She did not need to. It had the quality, that letter, of something that continues to work after a single reading, not because the words changed, but because she did, and what she brought to it changed with her, and the letter was patient enough to wait for each new version of the question she was asking. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the 6th month, when the young woman drove up the 2-track. Nora was at the south bench sorting seed packets from the fall harvest, labeling, dating, paper folding the tops the way Edith had shown her, which was to say the way the packets on the west bench had shown her, which amounted to the same instruction. She heard the car come in and did not look up immediately. By October, she had learned to let people find their way to the door at their own pace, that the greenhouse had a quality that required a moment of adjustment, that most people stood at the threshold for a beat before they came inside, taking in the smell of peat and linseed oil and living plants and whatever it was underneath all of that she had stopped being able to name because she had been breathing it for too long. The young woman was perhaps 22, in a coat too thin for October, with a canvas bag over one shoulder, and the particular, careful composure of someone managing more than she was showing. She stood at the open door and said she had seen the sign at the road, and asked if she was too late in the season. Nora looked at her. She said it depended on what she needed. The young woman said she was looking for work, that she had been driving through and her car was using oil faster than it should, and she wanted to get it looked at in Cutter's Mill, but needed to earn something first, even a few hours. She said this the way people say things they have practiced saying, plainly, without decoration, not asking for more than the words asked for. Nora set down the seed packet in her hand and looked around the greenhouse. There was a flat of winter spinach starts on the east bench that needed to be moved to the cold frame Earl had built along the south wall. There were 2 bushels of dried bean pods on the potting bench that needed to be shelled and sorted. There was a section of glazing compound along the northeast corner that had gone soft and would need to be removed and reapplied before the first hard freeze. She picked up the flat of spinach starts from the east bench and held it out. The young woman came inside and took it with both hands, careful with the weight. Nora showed her where the cold frame was. She did not ask her name yet. There was time for that. There was time for most things, if you did not rush them. By evening, the spinach was in the cold frame, The beans were shelled and sorted into labeled paper bags, and the glazing compound on the northeast corner was smooth and properly seated. Nora paid the young woman $40 in cash and showed her where the spigot was so she could wash her hands. The young woman held the bills for a moment before folding them into her coat pocket, and something in the way she held them, briefly, without counting them, the way you hold something you did not expect, made Nora look away and give her the moment. The greenhouse was warm from the day's sun still held in the glass. Outside, the field to the west had gone the pale gold of late October, and the tree line to the east was dark against a sky that was shifting from blue to the particular gray-purple that comes just before the light goes entirely. Nora latched the cold frame for the night and stood for a moment at the south wall looking at it. A thing that is tended comes back. That was all. The light inside the greenhouse reached the glass and passed through it, and the field beyond held it for a moment, and then the evening came on. And the greenhouse stood in it, lit from within, quiet and whole.